Another state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I had to start, or we never were. Your host, Too Black. How are y'all doing today?
Oh Lord, I'm good. Well.
Damn, Dougie.
Today,
we're barely making it.
Yeah.
We are on this struggle bus.
Yeah, it's been a long week, and we got a bunch of fucking theory to go through. That makes it even harder.
Right, let's straighten up, you guys. Come on.
So today's myth is first. I'll just skip that. Today's myth is Marxism is Eurocentric. I was telling Ryan off air. Never, when we started this show, would I have thought this would have been a subject that I would even approach. Not because I had an issue with Marxism, I just didn't think it was very relevant. But as more research was done, we found that this is relevant. If you get on Twitter, this myth is constant. Like someone's always saying something about Marx, and Marx becomes a debate. So to clarify, before we even get into anything else, we're not here to defend Karl Marx as a person. This is not some kind of hero worship. We have other interests, but the methodology many African people have taken up, so we feel like we should investigate. But we'll get to that later. So real quick, I do want to shout out the Patreon people. I've failed to do that the last few episodes, so real quick, brother Zach, Sparrow Hawk, TK June, Mel Evans, Chance, and Jay. I believe those are the people I missed. If I missed anyone else, I apologize. But thank you all for signing up. So yeah, if anybody else wants to, hop on or wants to contribute, we are taking all we can get. Every episode takes a lot of research. Several books are always read to do an episode, so we can actually give y'all accurate information, and we're not just giving hot takes. So, we appreciate anything that can help with that. All right, so before we get into the monologue and everything, just curious what y'all reactions are to this myth, because again, this is not something that, I don't think any of us envision ourselves covering once upon a time, but we all have evolved. So I'm just curious what some of y'all are thinking about it.
I think it's really interesting when we talk about just like how we're going to get free. And I think so often, because there are so many people and so many instances throughout history where we've had white folks specifically coming in to create like dissension, that anybody else who might have something that is solid, especially when it's like grounded in research, when it's really secure and it's actually something that's valuable to us, it gets picked apart. And I think that there's always a value in skepticism and making sure, like, is this actually going to be beneficial to us? But I think that also can be a detriment, in a sense of like, just because it's not necessarily coming from somebody who is Black doesn't mean that it's not going to be beneficial. Doesn't mean that we can't utilize this for our own liberation. Doesn't mean that it's not something that can be utilized across the world as we all aim to like destroy the system. So I think that was like just a really strong point when thinking of like the myth as a whole.
I think that's a good point. I really didn't get introduced to Marxism until later on in life. Now, in certain classes at IU, like they would mention, communism, the Red Scare, and everything, but didn't really delve into it until later on in life. And then I remember hitting Black. I was like, I don't know. I might just be a socialist. I might just be a communist. But Yeah, so it's a part of our history that they keep really on in wraps. You know, they keep it under cover. They really don't expose that. Um, and to, I guess, repeat Black sentiment, we didn't really envision us going this way. And when we first started this podcast, but it's kind of cool how it just became like a natural evolution. In a lot of ways, a lot of our Black radicals and revolutionaries, it became like a natural evolution, them leaning toward these ideals. And I think it's going to be interesting to actually have an episode where we break this down piece by piece, bit by bit. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, so yeah, similar to Ryan, like we all grew up with capitalism, so that's it's almost that default what we go back to, and we kind of have to catch ourselves and like, oh wait, no, there's other options, or there's other ways to deal with, you know, certain things in the world. But I don't know, just in the little research that I've done with it, the whole thing, that just going off the title of the myth, Marxism is a Eurocentric ideal. Nah, just in the hood by ourselves. Like, these are concepts that we embrace and we hold on to.
Yeah.
Like,
whether we realize it or not.
Whether we realize it or not, these are concepts that we embrace and hold on to, and that we practice. Yeah. Whether we know what we're doing or not, in practice, we are doing this. And even after the very glossed over ideal that we get in school of socialism and communism and everything, you know, even from that young age, I was like, that actually sounds okay.
Yeah.
It's often, I mean, I think this is something we talk about all the time, of like, I think scholars especially utilize vocabulary and language that makes it not feel tangible, but these are conversations that have been had since the beginning of time. Folks have already understood like their place in the world and have had these conversations in communities, whether you're talking about, you know, how to pay your rent next week, you're talking about gas prices, you're talking about the fact that you work at hours on hours on hours and yet you still can't pay a bill. You're talking about why you ain't got no street lights, why we don't have no trees, kids not having good food. Like, we have always been critiquing our environment in the same capacity that scholars have been also talking about it. We just may not have always had the language to actually describe like what the situation was. And now I think when, and not enough people also put this in layman terms, which makes it to where community members, and that's one of the reasons why we started this podcast, was to make sure that we could debunk this shit in a manner that folks could feel it and it was digestible, and not in the notion of like we need to dumb it down, but no, like this needs to be told in a space that allows for folks to hear it, understand it, and then be able to articulate how to apply that in their everyday lives the same way that we do, because we don't know everything that we're talking about until we're doing the research to it. And then all the time we're like, fucking light bulbs are going off. This doesn't make sense.
Bro, with the research we were doing, the whole time I'm sitting here looking like, all right, I need to hit up Cam or Black or Ryan. Somebody's got to dumb this down. Like, somebody's got to put this in nigga terms for me. Not that nigga terms is dumbed down or anything or stupid, but
just a language you understand.
But at the same time, isn't that what, you know, because we fit into that Black radical tradition. I mean, that's the same thing. I mean, Black Panthers did, to make sure you put it to where they can understand it. A lot of our, I guess you would say, ancestors did that. Just put it to where they can understand it.
Like, put it to where we can put it in layman terms, put it to where we can understand it, and put it to where we can put it into action.
At its core, the Black Myths podcast has always been about curiosity and investigation. We want to understand how the world works for the ultimate goal of doing something about it. We are not interested in proving a myth is true or false solely for the purpose of proving that it is true or false. That would be a useless endeavor. Our position is that the activities inspired by myths we cover are harmful, people are misled by bullshit, and as a consequence, this misleading further perpetuates Bullshit. Therefore, the methodologies and ideologies that people take up to explain the material world matter, thereby they must be examined. So our inquiry into whether Marxism is Eurocentric is not reducible to an intellectual question. We are not interested in mounting a defense for a, quote, dead white man or converting you to be a cult follower of him. We want to understand how discipline of Marxism, a discipline that, as abolitionist scholar organizer Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, where, quote, most of the Marxists in the world are not white and not men, end quote, is viewed somehow as Eurocentric. Why did some of the most colonized nations throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, such as China, Vietnam, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, Burkina Faso, Angola, Mozambique, Cuba, and so on, use some version of Marxism as a tool to help guide them towards freedom for their colonial masters, if it's so Eurocentric? With this history in mind, it would seem like there was something to investigate. But what do we know? Why would black people be drawn to an ideology that says you're not being paid your worth? Not only that, but you're being exploited by a few rich people who don't perform any labor, and the only way to reconcile the situation is through revolution. Oh, and here is the methodology to achieve it. I wonder why that would be appealing. Since the guy who made it comes from Europe, we probably shouldn't listen, I guess. As Walter Rodney said in his new posthumous collection, Decolonial Marxism, quote, people have no difficulty relating to electricity, but they say, Marx and Engels, that's European. Was Edison a racist? But they ask the question, was Marx a racist? They genuinely believe that they are making a fundamental distinction, whereas in fact they're obscuring the totality of social development. Most of us don't unscrew all the light bulbs in our house or turn off the TV because Europeans developed the technology. We understand the application goes beyond them. Kwame Ture said we must judge a thing by its principles, not by its followers. But if we were to judge Christianity on the behavior of white Christians, then Jesus is a terrorist. If we judge flying on a plane based on a drunk pilot, then flying would be synonymous with death. So if we were to judge Marxism by some of its followers, then yes, it would be Eurocentric, particularly today when you have people calling themselves socialist patriots and MAGA communists, and yeah, that's actually a real thing. Yet the internal principles that govern a concept are how we arrive at a scientific conclusion of what it is or isn't. As Kwame Ture also noted, Karl Marx discovered nothing. He simply observed what was the already existing laws of capitalism. Ultimately, labeling Marxism as Eurocentric discourages black interest in socialist ideas. This is not to say that Marxism has a monopoly on socialism, but as the most prominent form, demonizing Marxism promotes a type of anti-communism that encourages the reactionary drive towards backwards ideas like black capitalism. It teaches a historically communal people that a rugged individualism is a path to liberation. It pits us against each other while denying us the opportunity to access all of the tools necessary to improve our situation. So for the remainder of this episode, we want to explore the tools of Marxism, some of the criticisms against them, and review the history of what our people and all colonized people have done to liberate themselves with these tools. If we understand Marxism as a discipline, then our contributions to it only stretch it further, so let's investigate.
Must be clear here and not confused. I'm a socialist. One other thing I must tell you now. They confuse people about socialism. Brother the other day said, why ain't no socialist? I said, why not, brother? He said, because it's a white thing. I said, oh, really? You see, Europe tries to make believe that everything that comes out of the world comes out of Europe. I told the man, I said, socialism ain't no white thing. He said, yes, it is. He said, Karl Marx discovered it. I told him, Karl Marx never discovered socialism. He cannot. You call the laws of gravity Newton's laws. I'm sure there's a mnemonic device to help you on your quizzes. But you certainly cannot believe that Isaac Newton can found that a body falls at the rate of 32 feet per second squared per second squared. He can't find this. He can't discover it. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it, discover the law. If I'm sitting in Timbuktu in Africa, and I've never heard of Sir Isaac Newton, and I'm conducting any experiments with gravity, I will come to the same conclusion that he does. A body in motion tends to stay in motion unless stopped by an outside force. He cannot invent this. He can only observe it and record it. Marx did not invent socialism. If I'm sitting in Libya, in the deserts, and I'm doing any research with capital and labor without ever having heard of Karl Marx, I will come to the same conclusion that he did. That any time capital seeks to dominate labor, there'll be a ruthless, uncompromising struggle on the part of labor until it comes to crush capital and dominate it. This is a fact. My history demonstrates that. We came here as chattel slaves for centuries. We fought and fought and fought until we crushed it. Now we're just slave of the wage, and now we've got to rise up and crush that one. That's there that Karl Marx didn't invent socialism. It's there for all to see. Karl Marx's great contribution to the world was in the area of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, something you need to know if you know about socialism. But since you don't know about socialism, you don't even know the words. And not only does the enemy keep you ignorant, you stay ignorant. You won't ever go read a book about socialism. Why read a book about socialism? They already told me in my class it ain't no good. You will not even read a book about socialism. Why, you don't even read a book about your history. We come to inspire you to learn. We come to tell you that when you come to serve a people, you must know as much as you can. The more you know, the better able you are to serve the people.
Period. Yeah. Like, he don't miss, man.
Yeah, and when he was talking about observing, I mean, that's what science is. You're observing the material world, and then you are recording it. You might make your hypothesis, you test it a couple of times, keep testing it, make sure that the outcome is what it is, and then you record the outcome. And in the revolutionary left radio link that you gave us, they talked about how Marx utilizes not only just the economics, but he utilizes philosophy, science, so on and so forth. And that's just a example of how science works, you know, from a Marxist perspective.
Yeah, everything has its own internal nature and it's governed by its own laws. And simply to observe the laws that it's governed by and record those and then apply it to your situation. Nothing about that is quote unquote Eurocentric. We all do that. So, you know,
that's so important about science is your hypothesis is proven true if your evidence supports it, and it can continuously be found as fact over and over and over,
over
and over situations over time. And I think it's just like, and that goes back to what we were saying in the beginning of like, it's not a notion that people don't know these things. Sometimes that you just may not have had the language, or you may not have been able to have the time or the capacity to be able to like really do the research to lay this out and be like, this is really how it looks on a whole scale across space and time. You're like, I know what my situation looks like right here, right now. And I know somewhere in my mind that like other niggas is struggling like this. And so all Marx does is like be able to create like a full blueprint of like what is happening then, now, and hopefully not in the future, because our goal is to crush it. That's my favorite part. It's actually bad how many times I've seen that video.
So we're going to deal with this Eurocentric thing quickly, and then we're going to get to the actual like ideas that Karl Marx laid out and that other people, many African people and many colonized people have picked up. So people aren't just hearing this term Marxism and they don't know what we're actually talking about. But the claim has been made that Marxism is Eurocentric. So I've heard the word Eurocentric throughout at least half my life, probably 2/3 of my life. And it tends to mean various things. Sometimes people just mean it's a white-centered thing or European-centered thing. You know, it kind of normalizes the European way of life, so on and so forth. And that's the way it's usually explained to us. But as I was looking it up, like Eurocentrism, the first usage of it comes out of like Marxism and communism. So it's just funny that the people who the first people to theorize on it were Marxists, but now they're the ones who are Eurocentric. It's interesting, you know, to use a Marxist term, it's interesting dialectic. But like, so the first English appearance of the word Eurocentric was in a book, Muslim National Communism in the Soviet Union, a revolutionary strategy for the colonial world. So it was a book that was criticizing. The book really wasn't about Eurocentrism, but the word Eurocentrism was used in this book. And I just skimmed through it, and some of some of the people were criticizing a certain strand of Marxism that is Eurocentric, that does just center Western Europe and those views and doesn't look at the rest of the world. As I said in the monologue, some people can be Eurocentric, but if you take something by its followers, then a lot of things go wrong. If you just base it off a few followers that don't apply the correct method. And then from there was a book published called Eurocentrism by a Marxist economist, Egyptian French brother named Samir Amin, and he doesn't define Eurocentrism as simply just this kind of cultural thing that we've been taught. He understands Eurocentrism as capitalism that grew from Western Europe, that dominates the world, underdeveloped the colonized nations, and then it puts them on a course where they're supposed to set up, or they're supposed to catch up with the other nations, and that process in and of itself is Eurocentric. And then all the other cultural things that we usually complain about grow from there. So he's one of the early scholars on what's called dependency theory, which is to say that the colonial world, or the prior colonial world, what we mainly call the global south, or some folks even call it the third world, another term that's been confused. The third world is not about being a lesser world. The third world is actually when people didn't want to choose, or countries didn't want to go either the American capitalist way or the Soviet communist way. So they were like, we're going to do a third way, and we're going to have our own independence. We're not going to align with those countries. That's actually what the third world came from. Not just bum ass nations. Like, that's not actually a thing. Like, that's what we've
that up for me.
Yeah, that's what we've come to call it.
That actually makes a lot more sense, because they'll title a lot of third world countries, and the only depiction you ever get of them as bum ass nations.
Yeah, that wasn't the thing. Some of them might have chosen socialism or capitalism, but they weren't going to align in that kind of Cold War battle with either pact, right? So they were the third world, also called like the non-alignment movement. If you look up like the Bandung conference,
they chose their own pact.
Yeah. They were like, we're gonna we want our own self-determination, basically. Yeah,
because I'm glad you cleared that up, because there's I don't know about anybody else, but I know like the third world, that term developed in, kind of looked at as a pejorative term, in a way, like saying like, hey, third world means, like you guys said, bum ass countries or whatever the case.
Yeah, that's what it probably means to most people today. I don't know exactly when that switched, but that was not the initial like conception of it. There's even a term called third world Marxism. Like, there's people who practice third world Marxism. Like, that's an actual thing. And most people obviously in the third world are not white, but so there's that as well.
You hear that term thrown around in prisons as well.
That's what I said.
That idea of third world.
Yeah.
They just use that term. They take third world and apply it to this. Like, it's not actually that, but because third world sounds like, oh, they must be going through a poverty situation, or it's not going the way that they expected with capitalism, or not capitalism, but communism or socialism. And this is what they ended up with it. We're going to call that a third world. It means something totally different.
Yeah, because the internet kind of messed me up about
that. Yeah, it gets
going. Kind of messed me up about that, because I always felt, because years ago I saw like, I don't know, some internet thread, and then a lot of people were talking about, don't use the term third world anymore, and I always was kind of iffy about using it. But I'm glad you cleared that up. That's
that weird kind of like liberal discourse where if something sounds bad. Like, this is a side note, but I saw something where I heard something where like people claim that John Brown who who basically sets off the Civil War by fighting against the Confederacy. There were students claiming that John Brown was acting on white privilege. Like, this kind of anachronistic way of looking back at history. He was centering himself because he went to war. Like, that's what I mean. Like, so even someone like John Brown, this does kind of connect, because even someone like John Brown, who was one of the best white men America's ever given us, and there's not many to pick from, like someone like John Brown gets reduced to white. Yeah, he gets reduced to white privilege. It's like, if that's not like, that's just the kind of weird discourse we're dealing with. So yeah, so Eurocentrism is actually comes out of a Marxist theory on capitalism and colonialism and the connection between the third world or what's called the periphery countries and the core, or what's called the imperial core. That also goes on to build what's called world systems theory, which talks about basically there's the core countries like the first world who get all the resources for cheap, and they take the raw materials from the periphery countries, who basically just pay tribute almost in a semi-feudal relationship. And the reason that those countries can't keep up is because their labor is not tied to the labor of the people in the first world, quote unquote. So like here, as bad as things might seem, we can at least demand that our wages go up somewhat. We can demand we have some form of like labor organizing, even if it's very low. In some countries, they'll use what's called the petty bourgeoisie. That's what we call here bougie niggas. They'll use the people who, as like the kind of managers of these former colonies, to put down any kind of labor organizing, so they continue to get those resources for cheap, so they can take all the shit out of the land, like we talked about in the What's Africa Got to Do With Me episode. So Eurocentrism grows out of that. That's what Samir, I mean, that's the argument he's making. You never hear that, though, when people use the term Eurocentrism. It's usually cultural appropriation, or it's a mermaid or some shit, right? So just want to clarify that even when people use Eurocentrism, they're not quite getting at the roots of the term. And it's funny to call Marxism Eurocentrism when Marxism theorized a lot of the theories on Eurocentrism. So now when folks say that Marxism is Eurocentric, just want to go over some of these claims. They'll say Marx never spoke on slavery, which is not true. So here's a quote from Capital. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the enslavement and entombment in minds of indigenous population of that continent, the beginning of the conquer and plunder of India, the conversion of slavery into the presence for commercial hunting of black skins, are all things which characterize the dawn of the capitalist mode of production. These idyllic proceedings are chief moments of primitive accumulation. This is at the beginning, or this is not at the beginning, but this is in the book Capital, Marx's like premier breakdown of capitalist production. They'll say Marx theory is largely based out of study of Europe. This is semi-true because Marx and Engels, we'll get to Engels as well, they made most of their study and they applied most of their methods to the place that they lived. But they never claimed that everything that they came up with was completely universal. And actually, post like 1850, they started looking at other places in the world because they realized the people in England really wasn't about that life. They couldn't pull off revolution. So this is a quote from August Nimp's, who was a black Marxist. And he said, actually in a piece where he was criticizing this claim of European or Marxism being Eurocentric, by the end of 1848, they, as in Marx and Engels, had concluded that the fate of the German Revolution was linked to the successful outcome of a worldwide revolutionary process that combined national liberation, anti-feudal, anti-capitalist struggles, quote, and this is Marx, waged in Canada as in Italy, in East Indies as in Prussia, in Africa as in Danube. So they understood that the revolution needed to be worldwide. It wasn't understood that the revolution was simply supposed to be confined to Europe. Now, when they first started, they did think that that was where it needed to pop off. And as they saw through the actual materialist process of trying it, that this isn't where it's going to be. So they started looking elsewhere. This is another quote. At the beginning of 1860, Marx declared, quote, that the most momentous thing happening in the world is the slave movement. On one hand in America, started by the death of Brown, and in Russia on the other. Now, the slave movement wasn't started by the death of Brown. That he didn't get correct. Plenty of slaves had been resisting prior to Brown. But, you know, information was only so readily available at the time. You had the Haitian Revolution, all these things that already happened. They'll say they didn't recognize the limitations of Europe. I kind of already addressed this. But it says, as early as 1858, Engels began to have second thoughts about the revolutionary potential of England. When Chartist leader Ernest Jones sought to maneuver with liberal bourgeoisie by watering down the historical demands of the Chartist program, Engels wrote it was symptomatic of, quote, the fact that the English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeoisie. So that, to translate that, is to say like these folks are starting to sell out. Mm-hmm. That's basically what. So it's like they ain't really about that action.
Sounds familiar.
This next one I think is really interesting. This is Marx talking about the English and the Irish situation. Because remember, we just went through the Queen dying, which, great, good to hear. So the Queen just died. And me and Cam were having great fun on Twitter watching the Irish and the black people get together. It was fun, right?
Turn up.
Because the English colonized the Irish, and that's why they don't fuck with them.
Lindsay's in a box. That's wild. Yo. That shit's wild. Can you
that day will go down in history?
A football game in the United States. They're like, Joe Biden's dead. Joe cheering. Like.
That was one of the funniest days on Twitter.
I was in tears.
Wild.
I was in tears. Like that shit was. Yeah. I was.
Irish Twitter and Black Twitter definitely.
Yeah.
Did the whole fusion dance on that one together.
So Marx was.
Right, real quick.
Right.
Hell nah. So Marx was compared to English whites' antagonism towards Irish similar to that of the poor whites of the U.S. against black people. So he says, even industrial and commercial center of Europe now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps: English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. So he's saying this is a trick. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudice against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much as the same as the poor whites to the Negroes of the former slaves in the states of the USA. So again, they clearly saw the connections. Maybe they could have wrote more, but you can't say that nobody ever said any of this shit. This is actually a great analogy, and this happens all the time because that's the nature of capitalism, is it pits workers against each other. So the whatever little bit of crumbs you get above the next person, you might see that as an advantage. And because Irish workers might be used to break strikes, similar to how often black people in the early days of capitalism in America were used to break strikes as well, that white workers might have been involved in, often because they wouldn't let us in those unions. But they would see us as scabs or whatever. So there was this antagonism between the groups, even though all groups were getting exploited by the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie is simply the capital. They own the means of production. So there's
even thinking of the language against migrant workers that's so often played.
Yep.
Oh, the Mexicans are coming to steal your job.
Yep.
No, people are literally, as we're seeing, being told that they can come here and are working meager wages, working less than oftentimes. And then the narrative is constantly being spun. And instead of saying why do none of us make an equal wage, it's now being if they weren't here, then we will have more jobs for you, pitting more poor people against poor people.
Mm-hmm. And with this little excerpt right here, it reminds me, I think a year ago when I think Black and I started reading the Communist Manifesto, you start to realize why the idea of Marxism is so attractive, because a lot of the things he's talking about, you can be applied today. You see them today. I mean, them talking about English proletariats and Irish proletariats being pitted against each other. And then, like Cam said, you see that today, even migrant workers saying Mexicans are going to come steal your jobs and whatever the case may be.
Yeah, ADOS,
ADOS, you see that. And so that's why, like I said, that's why Marxism is so attractive. And, you read through some of the stuff and you're like, oh, snap, I can see that.
That's when you see the capitalist system failing, and all of a sudden Marxism and communism and stuff, these social ideals and all that, they start to become attractive. Hey, wait.
Hold on a fucking minute, literally.
Yeah.
This ain't working for me, but that ideal sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, people, and that's another argument about Marx. The material conditions change people start changing their minds. Like when you're like, oh, this ain't working, I'm gonna try something else. Like it's just a logical thing.
The logic of it and the science behind it, like the actual living science behind it, be like, this system isn't working, especially for my group of people. Okay,
Yeah,
try this.
Mm-hmm.
people will say Marx was racist. Again, we're not really interested in defending Marx as an individual. I'm sure he had plenty of problems. I'm sure he was probably problematic. I don't really care, honestly, but just trying to clarify the record here. Marx was an abolitionist against slavery, like he was an abolitionist. And I did not know this part. He actually was working for a paper. Marx was poor. He grew up in a decent family, but Marx himself was poor. He had 7 total children and lost 4 of them because he was so poor. Right, so this is the situation they were dealing with. So for Marx to turn down a job, just before I tell the story, that's not just a flex. So there was a paper he was writing for, I think right before he puts out Capital, and the Tribune paper, and they used to be like a hardline abolitionist paper, and this was during the Civil War. The paper got a new editor, and they supported a peaceful coalition between the Confederacy and the Union and the continuing existence of slavery. Marx resigned. So I ain't doing it. So if the man was racist, he wasn't in that moment. And a lot of times people say it, I'm just like, where are the receipts? Like if you want to find a letter, like the thing we just read on the Irish, like that's a documented letter. I can show you the primary source. If you have any, pull them up. And also, even if we found that this man said nigger one time, does that mean everything that he wrote is all of a sudden inapplicable and we can't use it? Like that doesn't even hold up anyways. Even if you find that letter, that doesn't discount the entire theory of something. Because again, there's plenty of things that you're using right now created by racist people, and you don't stop doing it. So I don't understand why this gets to like somehow looked at differently than other things. This somehow gets like held in a different light. It's just odd.
Nigga.
So there's people say Marx was anti-Semitic. I'm not really gonna get deep into this one. Marx was a Jew himself. There's like one passage that he said something that against the against Judaism. But the funny thing is, even in the Jewish question that they're talking about, he was defending the Jewish people because the person he was arguing against said that Jewish people only deserve rights if they were baptized. So Marx was arguing their defense. So whatever. And so some of the critiques, if you want to look at some okay critiques of Marxism, there's a book called Black Marxism. I do want to clarify, Black Marxism is not an introduction to Black Marxism. Black Marxism, the book, is actually a critique of Black Marxism and the practice of it. Some of the claims that are made in that book are some of the stuff we've addressed that I think are erroneous. And then some of them are worth reading. The term racial capitalism, that's one of the earliest versions, is in that book. So check that out. If you want to get a better understanding of this stuff, I mean, we're gonna go through a decent amount. But Dr. CBS is going to be in part 2 of this show. She has a book coming out, Organized Fight Win: Black Communist Women's Political Writings. So it's an edited volume, and they're covering Black communist women, which we'll talk about in part 2. And she also has a piece called Elaborations of Leninism, Self-Determination, and the Tradition of Radical Blackness. And she critiques the Black Marxism book and offers some alternatives or whatever. So if you want to check out more on that. But we're going to keep it moving. And also, I just one last point on this section. You can't solely reduce a theory that has been developed by many people simply to just one guy when plenty of people have contributed to it. It's just named after him. That's it. It's not all Marx. It's just named after him. So there's that. So who was Karl Marx? Not going to get much to the man's personal life because, again, not really interested. But Marx he lived from May 1818 to March 1883. He was a German philosopher, critic of political economy, economist, historian, sociologist, political theorist, journalist, and socialist revolutionary. And he is best known for the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, otherwise known as Capital, a critique on political economy. Great book, big ass book, long book. One of the few books I actually bought. So Marx's main companion in all of this struggle was Friedrich Engels. He was a German philosopher as well, critic of political economy, historian, political theorist, revolutionary socialist. Interesting about Engels, his father actually owned a factory, so Marx used to use the factory that his father owned to study so he could understand capitalism better. So Engels is actually what we call a class traitor because he was part of the bourgeoisie and he like defected and called for revolution. So these both of these gentlemen were kicked out of multiple countries. They couldn't get published because they used to have to put things in different like give their shit different titles because certain different European countries were trying to outlaw, and he kind of left his text. So they were on the run often, actually, particularly Marx. So Marxism as a term, Marx has always said, I am not a Marxist. Marxism as a term was not, like Marx didn't go around saying, hey, this is Marxism. Marxism was just trying to understand what the fuck was going on. And people who fuck with Marx were in this, I cannot remember, I should have put this in the notes, but they were in this beef in France with this other group. And they were like, we don't agree with y'all. So to draw the line, we're going to call ourselves Marxists. And initially, like Engels and Marx didn't want anything to do with this. And eventually, I think Engels, who lives longer than Marx, just gives in, and the term Marxism just kind of takes off. But Marx didn't ever walk around saying this is Marxism. So I just want people to know that, like
Jesus never walked around saying, "Hey, I'm a Christian."
Right. So that came into being in a kind of like clunky way. It wasn't, like this is the doctrine of Marxism. You should that's not how that went down. So,
not just telling niggas like, listen, what I'm saying is right. You need to listen to what I'm saying. You need to follow what I say. He's like, no, here's some shit I found out. I'm trying to put you on, and hopefully you will put somebody else on, and we will all get free. Hopefully.
Yeah. Now, Marx did write enough stuff. Marx and Engels did write enough in their time that could be coagulated into a theory. That could be put together to be something that we understand because they laid out basic principles. Vladimir Lenin, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, just so we can kind of synthesize, so we don't have to go over because Marx has a lot of topics. He said Marx's major contributions. He said Marx's doctrine is omnipotent because it is true, it is comprehensive and harmonious, and provides men with an integral world outlook irreconcilable with any form of superstition, reaction, or defense of bourgeois oppression. And then he said there's three main components that Marx contributed. It's the materialist philosophy, critique of capitalism, or what he called critique of political economy, and then socialist politics. So we're going to go over those three sections and the things that come out of that to better understand, Marxism as a philosophy, as a discipline, and as an economy. That's the thing about Marxism. It can be a philosophy, and then it can also be understood as an actual actual econ or actual form of economics, or at the time they called it political economy, and then it can just be understood as a politic all at the same time. Like that's how broad the man broke it down. So,
and political economy back in the day, today would be considered political science.
Right. And we used to understand political economy used to understand politics and economy, like they were, again, it had a dialectic, they were interwoven, as opposed to politics somewhere else and then econ some like just this hard data science driven econ. That's not how it used to be understood. People understood that politics influenced econ, but for whatever reason they switched those up. That's bourgeois education. So Marx pulls, we're going to go over the materialist philosophy. So we're getting into theory now. For those who don't like theory, you can come back later, whoever's listening. But we're going to try to make this make sense. The dialectical materialism is the hardest one usually for people to get. So we're going to start with that and try to work this out. And then we'll get through the other things. So dialectics comes from George William Frederick Hegel, or just Hegel as I always know him as. And so dialectics, I'm going to read a definition, but I don't think this definition is the greatest. I'm going to read it, and we're going to try to understand this just through normal talk. Dialectics is the method of reasoning which aims to understand things concretely in all their movement, change, and interaction with their opposite and contradictory sides in unity. We are aware of countless ways of understanding the world, each of which make the claim to be absolute truth, which leads us to think that after all, it's all relative. For the dialectics, the truth is a whole picture of which each view is more or less one-sided, partial aspect. So does that make sense to anybody? It doesn't have to make sense. All right. So like dialectics
No.
dialectics is like let's think about it as a unity of opposites. So initially with Hegel there was thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's really to say there's opposite forces or opposite ideas. You do this all the time. If you just think about your actual life, you'll think about something and you'll be like, what about that? And those are opposites. Those things are in contradiction to each other. Like you think about
those things form the full picture, right?
Right. So you think about, damn, I'm hungry, but I don't have any money. Like these things are in opposition to each other. So then how do I resolve it? So there's the thesis, there's the antithesis. How do I resolve it? I need to go get some money, or I got to go steal, or I'm going to resolve the fact that these things are in opposition to each other.
Look,
so
I'm hungry, but I'm broke.
Food bank.
Right.
I'm about to just walk out with the cart.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like, you resolve the contradiction. So that's like, so it's to say, the point is to say life is constantly operating that way. Now, Hegel understood this as more of a mental idealist conception, that this is how you think about things. So Marx says opposites in nature and social relations are not just ideas. So what you end up with Marx, he initially was following Hegel, like he was part of this young Hegel club. Like Hegelian dialectics was a big deal because Hegel at least starts to come out and say things are not static. Like there is opposites, and we have to think about things as in motion as opposed to it's just this one thing, and it's just there, and that's that. Like, but it was more so a mental thing. So Marx flips it on his head. So this is what he says in German Ideology. This is one of the books that he could not get published, actually. This book gets published in 1932, well after both him and Engels are dead. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history and no development, but men developing their material production and their material intercourse alter along with their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their collective thinking. So Marx is trying to get at, it's not just in your head. There's the material world, beyond just how I think about stuff as an individual. The material world has the same opposites that are constantly interacting with each other and resolving things, as opposed to just seeing it as there's the tree, there's the forest. The tree and the forest are in relationship with each other, and they're constantly building off of each other. The one tree that's part of the whole forest is part of the whole. So the trees inside the forest make up the forest, but then vice versa. Does that make sense?
Oh, what I was about to say is, kind of like what he said right here. They're not independent of one another. Like you said, they build upon one another. I guess it kind of reminds me of, that one of the videos that you sent where it said that Marx didn't care about, like, the religion, politics, whatever the case may be. The material world influences all of that. Those are secondary. Doesn't mean it's less important, but when you understand the material world and you understand how that works, that influences all the rest of the small aspects of like religion, politics, science,
right?
This, that. In a way, I guess dialectics is kind of like, it helped me, make sure you correct me if I'm wrong. There's different aspects that make up the overall picture.
Right.
But you have to understand the different aspects.
And those things are in those contradictions. A very simple example is if you play a game, you need a winner, or you have two sides. You can't win the game if there's not somebody on the side. So to have a winner, you must have a loser. And It's just very simple like that. Like, to have a winner, you must have a loser. If you drop out of the game, there's nobody to play, and automatically I can't reconcile it. So we play the actual game, and we struggle through literal opposites because we're both going for the same thing, but we're on two different sides of it to see who wins the game. It doesn't matter what the game is. It can be basketball, football. That is and that's constant. So that's how life is.
Right, and we're still on the same game board.
Right.
Okay.
So some things are not. So that's a relationship that's only reconcilable by someone losing, which is very much how capitalism works. Some things are reconcilable where we don't have to. We can figure out a way for these opposites to come together and transcend. But in a game, there has to be a loser. There has to be a winner, and the only reconcile that is for me to beat you. That's the dialectic.
And that's kind of like what Marx is talking about in regards to the struggle for capitalism. Like, there's capitalists, and then there's literally everybody else, and they win, we lose, and eventually we're gonna get tired of fucking losing. And so, as Kwame Ture said, we have to fucking crush.
I guess the ideology.
We can't just think about crushing them in our head. We have to actually strive to work together.
Right.
Collectively. And I think that's some part that gets so hard when folks, like, going back to the way that, like, I've thought about this myth is, like, if we're only viewing this as Eurocentric, if we're only viewing this as something that's not relevant to us, it actually, like, contradicts, like, Marx's whole concept of, like, we have to be working in tangent with each other. We have to be in a relationship with one another, because this is not just an issue. Capitalism is not just an issue that takes place in the United States. It's not just something that Black folks struggle with. It's something that is happening in Canada. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in India. It's happening all over the place. And until we all recognize and collectively learn together and strive to defeat this, then we lose, because there will always be somebody that'll be pit against us. Like, oh, you don't want to do it? Cool. We just export your factories to another country because they're willing to do it. But if if other folks in other countries are not willing to take these low ass wages either, then what do you do?
Yeah. Then it's in peril, right? So it's like,
then we have revolution on a global scale.
Yeah,
and it's what's needed.
Yeah. So what comes out of that, we got through dialectics, is there's idealism, and then there's materialism. Idealism is what comes from Hegel, and idealism again is reducible for simplification. And here is like that the world starts in your mind, and then you build from there. So, like, a lot of people have an idealist conception, because this is very much how capitalism conceives of things. So if I think about it, then I can manifest. Like, people say that shit all the time. Like, if I think about it, I can manifest it. But if you don't go out and do anything, you're not manifesting shit, right? But like, if I think about it, I can manifest, right? So like, that's kind of the idealist thing, that it starts in the mind, and then the material world comes from that. Marx says no. To have an idea, like we were talking about being hungry earlier, that's the material world. My stomach is physically growling, and I need to find food. So then the idea to get food comes to my mind. I don't just have a random idea that just comes out of nowhere to eat. There's something material that influences that, right? So like, and you can do this with anything else. Like, oh, I'm a slave, I'm in chains, I probably should figure this out. I don't just have an idea to be free. Like, it's based on my material conditions, right? So it's like, so he says the world is influenced, like the material world is the start of it, and then all ideas come from there. This is not to say, even though some Marxists are atheists, not to say that you can't have like metaphysical religious beliefs about things, but it's to say that even then, that still is part of the material world, that you then pray about the material world. Like Frederick Douglass famously said, my prayers didn't start getting answered till I started learning to pray with my legs. So it's like, that's the material world. So that's materialism. But the thing about the materialists of the time is they took it, what we call vulgar materialism. They went further. So they're just like, everything is matter. Like, literally everything is matter. Everything I think is matter. It's just matter. Like, all my thoughts just matter. Ideas aren't even real. They're just matter. And then the extreme idealists are just like, it's all in my head, and I don't even know if reality is real. So Marx rejects both of these ridiculous concepts and says that ideas matter, but ideas
simulation.
Right. But ideas come from the material world. That our observations of the material world are where our ideas come from, but our ideas influence the material world. Because if I look in the world, like I said, it's very simple examples. If I don't have food, I go get it. That influences the material world, right? And that's so. Then when we come back to dialectics, that's the constant back and forth. That's the and then we call that dialectical materialism. Like that's what he's saying. Does that make sense? I'm gonna keep asking y'all because I don't want this to go. Because I figure if y'all are saying it ain't going over your head, then it makes sense to the listeners.
No, I think that makes perfect sense.
Here's the thing, I get it. I mean, I get it. Like,
but I mean, once it clicks, it's like, oh yeah. Because again, you do this shit anyway. That's why I'm using stuff that we already do. Like, it's not anything far out. It's like you look in the world and you come up with ideas based upon what you think needs to happen. That's the argument Marx is saying. Say what?
Absolutely. And I think that's just probably one of the things, like when we were talking about the difference between how the Communist Manifesto is digestible, but capital is not. I think it's just, which is sad because there's so much knowledge that's in that. I mean, shout out to now you can use things like Audible, YouTube videos and things to describe it, but nothing that's in it, although it looks intimidating, although the language is intimidating, although it is thick, like everything that is in the book is things that most people already have an understanding of in their mind. It's just not something that folks necessarily are communicating collectively all the time about and know how to go from like, I recognize my issue, I recognize my situation. How do I actually go from here to then pushing past the point where you can then struggle in a manner that will garner like results that are real.
Yeah, and without laboring with these things, I mean, let's face it, without laboring with these things, there's no way we can gain liberation. You have to, on some level, go through with it. You know, even with this podcast, the amount of rigor that we use with a lot of the research and gathering everything to form a cohesive argument or whatever the case may be, there's a lot of labor that goes behind it. And if you're going to face the system, know that you have to know what you're up against, and that's not always going to be easy. So you're going to have to, there's going to be sacrifices that are going to have to be made.
Yeah, and you gotta, if you're under the boot of, if your neck is under the boot of someone, then you obviously need to figure that out. And sometimes that's not something that can always be handed to you on a platter. It's just not how the situation is. You shouldn't expect it to be that way either. A few more explanations, and we can get to historical materialism, which is not much different, but there's a slight distinction. So again, dialectical materialism is understanding the forces of nature and ourselves and how we operate with those opposites, and things are constantly in motion that we're trying to work out and resolve. And so some things have a contradictory nature that can't be resolved without one of those things being removed from the board. Like we were talking about with a game. Other things have a certain cooperative nature that can be resolved, and we can figure out the internal mechanisms of those things that we can figure out to bring them together. And people do this all the time. When you have an issue with somebody or a problem, you talk things through, and it's a dialectical conversation, because initially you may hate this person, but as y'all talk it through, you might come to an actual resolution. Yeah. Sometimes you realize, I don't like this person. There is no resolving it other than me walking away or doing something much worse. You know, like that's just what. So I'm using like basic examples, because I don't. We can get into political stuff. Say what?
Choosing violence.
Yeah, but I'm trying to use these examples because this is what people go through now. Examples of like idealism that often shows up in pop culture is like gender wars or relationship talk, when people don't assess the actual material situation, which is one of the principles of the show. We always say assess a material situation. So you have people who all work at call centers talking about they deserve the life of what Beyonce or Jay-Z gets. That's an idealist conception. You're not actually considering the real world that you live in. You're just throwing stuff out of your head that can't really truly be achieved. So you want a girl who can be a super person and cook all this shit for you and is extra made up and everything else, but you're not in a situation to even obtain that situation. or you want a man that can do all these things, and he's in shape or whatever, he's got to make this much money a year, and you're talking about black people who are consistently oppressed, but you somehow expect them to just will their way out of their oppression simply by thinking about it, not actually dealing with the material conditions. That's actually idealism. And people do it all the time. So it's like I always say, people want to discuss dating, which I'm never really interested in. Then you could really still apply this concept to it, because you're trying to understand why are people the way they are. There's material explanations for that. They don't just wake up in bad moods or problematic or toxic or whatever. People form those things through the material world they live in that influences the choices that they make. That if you take Marx's explanation of things, if you accept that, same thing when people say poverty is in the mind. Well, we know if I don't have any money, there's nothing in my mind that's going to bring me money. I have to go into the material world and actually obtain money. Now,
I don't give in to the victimization of black men. You know what I'm saying? If we stop spending all the money on Florence and Gucci's, you know what I'm saying?
Poverty is very,
you know what I mean?
Physical. It's very here and now.
Yeah.
I am a god.
Like I can believe that. I can believe that.
You know who I'm talking about? Fuck that nigga.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I can believe that and say that as much as I want, and just like I was gonna say all of us, but maybe just Cam. We have our self affirmations that we do.
Just Cam.
Just Cam.
But
I'm like, yeah, man.
I mean, we have those self affirmations that we do in our mind, but we understand that like our physical is going to be our outside circumstances and stuff. That's going to have some kind of impact on it.
Oh yeah, I definitely be in my head singing Beyonce, "These motherfuckers not stopping me," but a lot of the motherfuckers be stopping me on a day. In my head and in my mirror, they are not. And then
and that's the response.
Open the mail and I see a bill.
Even that's the response to the material world. Like I said, you're just kind of like
fucking traffic stopping me from getting where I want to go.
Keep yourself sane or keep yourself motivated. You know, because motivation or inspiration, like anything else, it's fleeting. Yeah. So you do something to keep you.
Listening to my drill shit, like, oh, a nigga tried me. That's his life.
We all do it in various ways. I'm
not cut out for 10 to 20.
There's some
but I don't think any of us. I think we all do the affirmation thing in one way or another, whether it's through music or whether it's just trying to tell ourselves to keep going, because we want to maintain motivation or inspiration, because most of that stuff is fleeting. But at the same time, I don't think any of us are underneath the illusion that it's just the affirmations that are going to bring us.
No. And it's like
successes or whatever the case.
Affirmations are fine within a certain level of reason.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because again, Marx isn't saying, we were talking about the gross materialists who think everything is just matter and there are no real thoughts. Marx is not saying that there aren't ideas and you don't need to have some kind of way to keep yourself motivated or whatever, but that idea is still attached to the material world. That's all I'm saying. Like ultimately, I tell myself I'm the shit, or whatever I need to tell myself to get through the material world, and I trying to behave a certain way while I'm in the world, but it's still attached to that. It's not simply something that's in my head. My head just influences my actual actions, and that's the dialectics of it again. So it's not. So again, so we can see how the idealist conception of things, where it's in your head, where it's just your bad behavior and you just can't get your shit together and you're just toxic and it's just very victim blaming. We can see how that fits very perfectly with capitalism, which tries to rely on this very individualistic narrative that if you just work hard and if you just do all the right things and you can be rich and successful. It ties perfectly with that. So most of these black capitalist folks push a very idealistic narrative because they don't want to deal with the material world for what it is. And when you try to get them to do that, they always push back and they say you're a hater or you're negative or you're pessimistic. When you're just like, no, nigga, we ain't got money. You know?
I mean, like 400 years. All y'all here, 400 years.
That or they shifted back
like a choice to me.
They shifted back to the idealism.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll do like as soon as you challenge them on it, like, oh well, what about my circumstances, or what about the physical world and what's going on around me and everything?
Like, what are you talking about?
Only your mental. You just don't have the right mindset.
Exactly.
No one did it, so why can't you do it?
Yeah,
if you
I'm
just
like,
push yourself hard, you can do this. Like, no, that's not the same.
And then when you argue back and forth with them, like, yes, I believe that I am a dope person. I'm great. I can accomplish all these things. I truly believe that in my mind. I want to manifest that. But the physical, the outside world, the realism, like, I have to combat that at some point, and just believing it isn't enough.
You and me, Terrell, with the Outcast, the Outcast podcast, we didn't just try and manifest that just by, we thought of it up, and you thought of the edits. You know what I'm saying? It's
nothing works that way.
Nothing works that way.
We're not just sitting there like it's gonna happen.
Even in defense of idealism, even though I don't agree, even like Hegel isn't saying that you can just literally just think about it and it happens. He's saying that it starts in your head and then the material world comes from that. Just so we're clear on not bashing idealism too much, I still don't agree. But I'm saying, like, they're still saying, like, some material part has to happen. But we're talking about the extreme idealists. A lot of these people are extreme idealists. They don't even want to deal with the material world at all. Like, they really think you just, like, and nothing works. Like, it don't work that way. You know what I mean?
Like, you just 3 times and be home. I think and there has to just be a balance. And I think that's really all Marx is saying. It's like, you can't get to a space where you can even be idealistic and hoping and wishing for these things to come if you don't have an understanding of the material conditions that your world operates from.
Exactly.
And even then, what you just explained, both of you and you, Kim, all of us, that's dialectical thinking. When you just went from, idealism, but also the materialism, where you just kind of said, we just don't want to bash on idealism too much. You just participate in the opposites right then and there.
Yeah, because again, we're trying to resolve and it's constant, and it's not just us as human beings. Like, nature's doing the same thing too, right? Like, that's the part. I don't want to read this quote, and then we'll move on to historical materialism. This is from Hubert K. Life. He said, in the Marxian view, human history is like a river. From any given vantage point, a river looks much the same day after day, but actually it is constantly flowing and changing, crumbling its banks, widening and deepening its channel. The water seen one day is never the same as seen the next. Some of it is constantly being evaporated and drawn up to return as rain. From year to year, these changes may be scarcely perceptible, but one day, when the banks are thoroughly weakened and the rain long and heavy, the river floods, bursts its banks, and may take a new course. This represents a dialectical part of Marx's famous theory of dialectical or historical materialism, like constantly happening. So it's
explain it. That is a dope way.
Yeah, that's perfect. So it's like,
I can't think of anything better. That's dope.
Nah, that's why I think the nature example just like really puts it in perspective, where it's like, this isn't really that deep. It's really just life and motion, right? Like, it's like, but it's like, so to think that things are static and stuck, but it also tells us that because things are not static and stuck, that things can be transformed. Yeah. That we don't have to just be pessimistic and feel like we can't do anything. It actually tells us that nothing is static, so you can transform it if you understand how it actually functions. That's why you study, right? So when we come to historical materialism, the argument is that human history is shaped by modes of production and their relationships to production. So now we're not just talking about it just in the motions of life, but we're saying that the actual way that an economy is set up dictates the mode of production in any form of history. It not dictates, but it shapes the relationships that people have. So we're talking about capitalism influences the thoughts and perceptions that we have about life, because that's the actual mode of production. And we'll define all mode of production, all those things. So Marx says, it is not like the idealistic view of history in every period to look for a category, e.g. measuring periods of history in accordance with certain ideas. but remains constantly on the real ground of history. It does not explain practice from the idea, but explains the formation of ideas from the material practice. Accordingly, it comes to the conclusion that all forms of products of consciousness cannot be dissolved by mental criticism, by resolution into self-consciousness, or transformation into apparitions, specters, whims, but only by the practice of overthrow of the actual social relations which give rise to the idealistic humbug. that not criticism but revolution is a driving force of history, also of religion, of philosophy, and all types of theory. An example of how we're driven by like the historical material relationship of things, like think about how when smartphones come into existence, how that changes our actual relationships with each other. That's produced by the mode of production. That's produced by capital. And smartphones and on top of social media changes the actual relationships that we have. And it's not something that we idealistically can fix. Like, so if I'm like, yo, I'm gonna log off, like that's a choice I have to make to detach myself, because the world is still built around that kind of interaction of social media, of being on my phone, of taking pictures, all of that. That actually changed our relationships. Like, we're all old enough to remember the world before that. We're old enough to remember when the internet was slow and you only got on it if you had it at your crib, if you stole one of those like AOL 750 like minutes. Like, you remember those days, like that was a different type of relationship. So when new technology is introduced through the mode of production, it actually changes the relationships that people have. So they're saying that that's a material relationship, and that history changes through those struggles. It moves through those struggles. A deeper example would be, we talked about Walter Rodney on our episode on What's Africa Got to Do with Me, another Marxist. And he talks about the underdevelopment of Africa, but he talks about early on that slavery wasn't initially conquest in a physical, like military way. It was like, the Europeans showed up with products that the Africans didn't have, and they traded them for slaves, right? And then those products became products that other people wanted. So then they started trading slaves, and then an entire economy was built around those products that the Europeans were bringing, and then everybody was trading slaves. It was an economically imposed program on the west coast of Africa, right? So that's the historical materialism that changed the relationships that people have with each other. So then you get what's called the base and the superstructure. And if I'm going too far, just cut me off. So Marx is saying on the base, the productive forces and relationships, the economics of production, that's the material that shapes, that's the materialism that shapes the economy, that shapes our day-to-day interactions. And then what's on top of that, the ideas that come from that mode of production, is a superstructure. That's how you get laws. That's how you get businesses. That's how you get government. That's how you get religion, the state. All of those things are built on top of those acts because they're built to reflect the mode of production, because that's the way we have to organize around those things. So if I want to start a business, I gotta have what I gotta have today. I gotta have a social media. I gotta have a certain business card. I have to have a profile. I have to have a brand. I have to have followers. That's how I'm going to get involved in the economy. That's the superstructure. Now, some people will argue the superstructure today, that this is an advanced form of capitalism, the base and superstructure have come together, but that's another deeper philosophical argument to not have. So that's how you get the base and the superstructure. And then you can see the kind of like materialist ideas on top. You can see the same relationship he's talking about with the dialectics. So the base and the superstructure dialectically operate with each other, as in to say that the mode of production can be changed by some ideas that come from the superstructure and vice versa. And they're constantly in relationship and push and pull with each other. So you need to overthrow the mode of production to reconcile the forms of oppression that you would deal with. That's essentially the way I understand it, at least. These are not deterministic models. This is something, again, it's dialectical, so it's constantly in motion. So Marx says there is no royal road to science. Only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. That dude could write, man. I'm just saying.
Beautiful.
But
that also like goes back to when we saw the clip in the beginning of comments where talking about like you are not going to be able to understand your world. You're not going to be able to continue to service your community and others unless you do the work to learn more. Like there's just no way to just sit here and be like, I just know everything. I know how to do this. I know how to figure this out. Like, it is going to be a struggle, and you have to educate yourself continuously in order to be able to be in a space where like you can actually see the world for what it is.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I say you have to labor toward liberation.
And it's a steep path, y'all. It's steep, and I fall, and it's stressful, and you're tired and dehydrated at times, and the elevation gets to be a fucking lot.
The mental turmoil that you get from
it's a muscle.
Doing the,
it's a muscle, you know, just like anything else. It's a muscle. So just like it's hard to pick up 300 pounds if you've never lifted weights, you know, like you're not doing that more than likely. So it's like, but you can work your way up, but it's a muscle, and it's something, again, idealism, I think, promotes a certain, like, I don't want to say laziness, but a lack of curiosity, because you're not willing to try that because it's either you're scared of it, you've been told it's this static, like, scary boogeyman thing, or the material world puts you under so much stress you just don't even have time to investigate it either, right? So
so most people stop at the idealism stage,
right,
and don't venture beyond that.
Nah, so that's the dialectics of that as well. Like, there's different ways that it works.
Capitalism just kind of stamps out that whole motivation, and
it does
to even do any of that, because like you talk about
100%.
Even if you have those ideals, those I want to change this, I want to do this, but because I'm under this capitalistic system, I still got to go to work. I still got to do this. I still got to unwillingly feed into the machine to make sure I'm okay at the bare minimum.
Yeah.
So on to his critique of capitalism. So we just got done. That's his philosophy. That's his philosophical side. All these things interact with each other, obviously, but that's like the philosophy. You know, I'm sure there are more trained Marxists. That's a shots fired. If anybody caught that, but like, there's more trained Marxists out there who might feel like we're not articulating it in the way that they like. But I think this is making sense, so we're gonna move forward. So just to give some quick definitions, when we say the modes of production, and I'm taking these definitions off of Marxist.org. I chose not to write my own for these few. So the method of producing the necessities of life, that's the modes of production. So whether for health, food, housing, needs such as education, science, nurturing. So again, just the method for producing the necessities of life. What is the actual process that we do that? Very simple. So then we have the productive forces. Productive forces are the unity of the means of production. So you're talking about labor, the instruments of production, which is the buildings, the machines, and then the subjects of production are the raw materials. So capitalists own the means of production. They own those raw materials. They own the technology that those raw materials are refined, that they go through, and they also own the labor, what is understood as labor power, because you sell your labor. So then the relations of production, the objective material relations that exist in any society independently of human consciousness, form between all people in the process of social production, exchange, and distribution of material wealth. So we all work, we all do labor. So what are the relationships in which we do that labor? You know, that we can talk about the divisions of labor as well, but like, what are the relationships in which we do that labor? So in capitalism, the relationship is a competitive relationship. It pits people against each other. Right? Like, that's the relationship. Under socialism or a higher form communism, there's supposed to be a cooperative relationship that doesn't pit people against each other. So what Marx is describing isn't simply just some like economical thing. It's a social relationship that capitalism puts you in. He's trying to understand, what is that social relationship? So then we go to private property. That gets thrown around a lot, but I want to get on this one because a lot of times I don't think this is very well clarified. Private property is the right of an individual to exclude others' use of an object, but private property should not be understood as your phone or your house That's not, when people say private property, that's often how it's explained. But private property is the means of production. That's mainly what we're talking about. And then that trickles down to how we understand private property, because we want to be able to own our things too. But ultimately, private property is to say there's water in the city, and somehow a company owns the water company, right? Like some individual private ownership of things that we all need. Someone owns that. Somebody owns the actual materials. Say what?
That comes naturally.
Yeah. So someone owns the materials out of the ground.
Provided to us by Mother Earth. They own that.
Right.
Or even how like Monsanto can patent certain seeds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That becomes private property, because we're saying that the things that actually produce wealth and that produce subsistence, the things that we all need to be okay, like they said, the necessities of life, those things are privately owned. And then the rest of us who don't own those things, the only way we can receive those things is to sell our labor to the people who own those things. Yeah. Like, that's the relationship of capitalism.
Farmlands.
Yeah. So like early stage capitalism, well, Marx, and this is where some people will try to accuse Marx of eurocentrism, because this kind of stage of production that he names isn't as consistent in other places of the world, but he was studying again Europe. So he talks about like early stage, like different modes of production. So at the very beginning of like human life, there's communalism, or like some call it primitive communism. Primitive is not meant in a derogatory way that we would understand it today. It's just early on. So there weren't classes. People shared the resources that they made in their villages, hunters and gatherers. And that was essentially communism. Everybody was taken care of. Well, everybody wasn't taken care of because there wasn't enough stuff produced. So often people were hungry, but whatever people had, they shared. Then you go into...
And for the most part, people were equal.
Right. There weren't classes, and classes as in like, we are over the means of production and y'all get to eat off of the crumbs we'll give y'all. That wasn't necessarily a thing. As time went on, then became a slave society where people actually enslaved people in a different way than we would understand chattel slavery, that was connected to capitalism and early feudalism or late feudalism. This was a different type, but people would enslave folks, and then that's when classes started to form, because more things were being produced, as Marx would say, as man started to understand the laws of nature. After that, you get feudalism, where feudalism is, I own a certain space, you can live on my land. You can even have a little bit of land yourself. Whatever you produce, you pay a tribute to me, and you are a serf. And that is that. You never get out of that situation. That's the extent of it, right? And then we work for a king or some kind of monarchy, and that's usually the relationship of feudalism. Again, I could go into longer, more detailed explanations, but it's simple. Capitalism says you don't have to work. We're trying to expand capital. We're trying to expand our own ownership of the means of production. So we can't confine ourselves to like just enclosed lands. We need to get people off these like farms and these small lands and bring them into the places that we're trying to work, and the factories and the stores. So there was something called the enclosure movement in England, where literally people were kicked off their farms. Literally people were kicked off their lands, and some folks were killed and beat up. And this is what Marx calls primitive accumulation. So they could go work. Say what?
I would say, or they were kicked off common land that was just to be like, hey, we all farm here. You farm over there.
Right.
Maybe next week I farm there. You farm here, depending on what you're producing. And then whatever government entity comes by and says, I'm gonna make a law that says you can't farm here.
Yeah, enclosure. This is our land. Yeah,
this is the land under the king. You're not allowed to do this here.
Yeah, he
wants to hunt here, and he wants to make sure this is clear for him not.
Yeah,
and they'll reason it by some bullshit explanation just like that. Like, excuse me, you can't hunt here because you can't do this here because the king needs this for this.
And if you resist, we might brand you, we might beat you, like things can go wrong for you because we need. So that was a way of forcing people into the low wage labor market. Again, this is in England, and starts to happen all throughout Europe. And we're trying to force you so you can. So now you don't own the means of production, because the means of production can also just be like, I have my, like, you can have a garden in your backyard and you can produce food. That's the means of production in the sense that you're actually producing that on your own land, but you probably can't produce enough to feed yourself every day. Most gardens aren't going to do that if they're just in your backyard with, and it's not even an acre or whatever. But they're saying that's all you get, but you don't get to have this land for you anymore where you can produce for yourself. We take that, you come work for us, we'll pay you a wage. That's capitalism. Now, in other parts of the world, this stage of production didn't go exactly this way, and this is often where it's fair to critique Marx maybe of understanding other ways, but I don't think that leans all the way to Eurocentric. It's just we expand the doctrine. So then we go from that to a commodity. So that's the basis of capitalism, is the commodity. A commodity is something that is produced for the purpose of exchanging for something else, and such is the material form given to a fundamental social relation, the exchange of labor. Marx says the wealth of those societies in which capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as the immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. That's how he starts the book Capital. That's like towards the beginning. I'm not going to get into all the different stuff. Like there's use value and exchange value. Basically, it's like a commodity can do something for you, and then a commodity can be exchanged for someone else. So the economy turns into, can I create a commodity that I can exchange? So I, as a business owner, I make phones not to keep them for myself, but so I can sell them, right? And then that becomes the way we circulate money, and that's how we get quote unquote capital. Money, commodity, capital. Like that's because commodities or capital is money in circulation. So then this is where Marx really gets. This is where Marx like becomes relatable in this analysis. Capitalism is a labor theory of value. And the labor theory of value is a proposition that the value of a commodity is equal to the quantity of social necessary labor time required for its production. So if Terrell works, the time that Terrell worked and whatever he produced, that's the value. Very simple. So as a capitalist, I cannot pay Terrell the value that he's actually produced. Not. So how do I
make no money?
Yeah. So how do I extract the value from Terrell and not pay Terrell fully for what he has produced? So that's how we already talked about labor power, so I don't think I'm gonna skip that. Well, I'll clarify quickly. Labor power is literally just the labor you sell to the capitalist. That's really simple. Like you don't have anything to sell because you don't own the things you need to eat. So you sell your labor. You sell your labor. Say what?
So you're essentially selling your time.
Yeah. This is why when some people will like defend sex work, they'll say sex work is labor or whatever, because it's like we all sell our bodies. Like some of us sell it to make shit, the other of us sell it for other things. But we're all selling our body in a sense because you ain't got nothing else. so that's what you sell, right? We don't. So Marx comes up. He realizes a thing called surplus value. Surplus value is the social product of which is over and above what is required for the producers to live. So I pay Terrell a wage, which is not the value of what Terrell made. I pay him a wage so he can go out and get the things he needs so he can come back and work for me tomorrow. And
that's enough so I can do that.
Yeah, just enough for that. So this is Hottest Thier wrote the book The People's Guide on Capitalism. So the capitalist pays you for the cost of your labor power, not the value of the goods you produce. Thus, your paycheck is worth the exchange value of your labor power, but the use value of labor power is a production of a greater value. So you produce more than you make.
Absolutely.
You don't get the full value of what you make, right?
That's like a farmer. Like if you are somebody who works on a farm, you might plant, even in planting season, right? You're planting thousands of dollars worth of crop, but you're not going to see anywhere near that much money coming back because it's not yours technically.
Yeah.
I think commission work breaks that down the most efficient way. Like I can literally do a loan or sell a vehicle or this or that for $30,000.
Yeah.
And I'm
Then
getting a commission of we'll say 10%. Granted, that's not going to be that at all. Small percentage of what that value material is.
Yeah.
So you're not getting your worth as who you are to sell that vehicle. You're just getting a percentage of what that material is worth.
Even in the field that I'm in, I mean, student debt is at 1.6 trillion. You think we see any of that? No.
That's what I'm saying. Like, and even if you do service labor, which is to say you may not do something that's directly, well, service labor really is these jobs, but even if you do something like teach, you aren't doing something that is directly tied to profit, not directly tied. Like in the sense,
I mean, if you teach a child that ends up becoming a doctor, are you getting doctor wages?
Nah. No. And then also like
the ROI is love.
And also,
free lunch.
And even that, you're just being paid. They're just still paying you a wage because you have to train the laborer so they can come to work. So exactly. That's the whole concept of being a teacher. You have to train the laborer. Or you think about the unpaid labor that women often have to do. You have to rear the child. You have to make sure the child's happy. You got to feed this motherfucker. You got to do all these things. And that doesn't get, you don't get any money off of that. But that's unpaid labor as well that goes into so the laborer can go to work and produce whatever the capitalist needs.
Did y'all hear how disgusted he was in that? You're like, you gotta feed this motherfucker. I gotta change this bitch ass nigga.
Can't believe I'm changing this nigga shit.
He was so disgusted with it.
And right there, we just explained why Marxism is so attractive to us.
Yeah.
I think even thinking about the capitalists and like the ways in which like they win in the end, I think there's a quote about my favorite place. It's not my favorite place, but
Disney World.
His quote on Starbucks, like, and how that is used to exploit is just really solid. I'm saying, like, let's say you work for Starbucks and they pay you $120 for an 8-hour shift, but you can make $120 worth of fancy coffee in an hour. And anybody who's been a barista knows damn well that just 1 hour of breakfast rush, you've already made that and more.
Yeah.
And you can probably make that in a half an hour in a busy store. But even once you subtract the cost of the materials and the use of the equipment, Starbucks doesn't pay you anywhere near the value that you've created, which is thousands of dollars a day. They buy your labor power from you, not the actual fruits of your labor. And then you make that value back for them in an hour. So basically the rest of your shift, you're working for free.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is the bourgeoisie would be nothing without the proletariat. Nothing.
Yeah, because I think
free coffee. You still have to buy the coffee.
There used to be a quote like, "Your boss needs you. You don't need your boss." That used to be like an organizing quote for labor, because it's like Marx talks about it. If capitalist buys all the machinery and there's no labor to put into it, then it's what we call dead labor. Like there's nothing there, right? So it's like you need someone to actually produce off that labor, and everything, even the machinery, is still made by labor. Like Anthony Bourdieu, another Marxist, talks about how capital is just accumulated labor. Like it's all ultimately comes back, and that's what Marx is saying. And the Marx getting at basically, you can actually quantify the rate of exploitation. Like it's not a abstract thing. So keeping with Thier's book, she gives them the same examples. She said, if we return to Starbucks, perhaps the executives there invest $360 a day in constant capital, and that's the store's espresso machines, the coffee grinders, the refrigerators, all the technology. The barista, for her meager paycheck, sets to work on the coffee grinders and espresso machines, producing the first $120 of lattes, cappuccinos, caramel, I don't even know what that says. I don't drink this shit.
A macchiato.
In the first hour.
You just didn't want to.
In the first hour, enough to cover her paycheck. She produces another 840 of drinks in the next 7 hours for a total of $960 worth of drinks. After paying out wages and expenses, an extra 480 is left. So Marx expressed this with the formulas. So there's constant capital, which is the machinery, plus variable capital, which is labor, minus, so the constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus. In the case of our made up Starbucks example, this would be 360 plus 120 turns into 360 plus 120 plus 480. It is a ratio between the part of the day that creates the value of your wages and the part of the day in which your labor is unpaid. In this sense, case of 480 over 120 is 400%. So there's a 400% rate of exploitation. You can take this and plug it in whatever you produce, and once you get all the variables, you ultimately can come up with an actual rate of exploitation of which you're exploited. Like, so Marx gives you that, and if you work in this situation, then they're not paying you. So when people say we want a fair wage, there's no such thing. It's a wage. Like, there is no fair wage. Like, there might be a fair wage in the sense that it's enough money to pay you so you can take care of yourself. But if you mean a fair wage, like, I want to be paid for my worth, well, then you're not going to get that under capitalism, because there's no such thing. If you're a wage laborer, or even if you work salary, they've already calculated that we're going to make more money. We're going to pay you so we can make more money. And if you do get your value, then the capitalists fail. There's no point of doing it. They go out of business. So even for the capitalists,
whether it goes from $7.25 to $15, they've already factored in the fact that I'm gonna get free labor out of you either way.
Yeah, that's why when you bring up the wage, even when they'll say, well, what are the people who don't want to raise it? It's gonna hurt small business. That's another way of saying they can't exploit you. They'll have to pay you the actual money that you're owed. So, and they don't have enough capital like a big corporation to shovel that out, because they're an upstart business or whatever. So we got to keep the wages low. And often small businesses are more exploitative as far as just straight up on the wage in many cases than even a big business, because they don't have the capital to shell out, right? So you're not going to be making a bunch of money working at some random mom and pop restaurant. And it's not because these people are inherently evil. It's just the nature of capitalism. So even if one of us start a business, if Ryan starts a business and he wants to hire all of us, that Ryan cannot make this a successful business. Even if we're friends, if he doesn't make more money than what he put into it, he just can't do it. Like, so it doesn't matter if Ryan's a good or bad person. It's just the nature of the thing. Like, he can't benefit from it.
At its core, it's evil, and it's designed to function in a manner that will continuously exploit us. And I think that's what Marx is pointing out. He's like, this formula can literally be plugged in any place, in any situation, on any continent, because this is applicable to everybody that functions within a capitalistic society. Like, we're all being exploited, and it is those that are in the bourgeoisie that are winning. Like, they know what they're doing. Like, they're not, even if you don't know it and you're not intentionally doing this, like a small mom and pop shop, it's not that they're blind to it, because they're still turning a profit. They're still trying to make money from their business and come out on top. And then when you go larger and larger, like, they hella know. There are whole departments that your job is to literally showcase how much money we're making on a regular, and cut people if there are spaces where we can be making more, but we're not.
Yeah, that's just.
I don't want to think that we're against people not getting paid more on the job, because, you know, in the system that we're in at this moment, we want you to get paid as much as you can. It is what it is. You got to get paid. You got bills, but understand that when you're fighting for, you know, from $7.50 to $15, it's possible. They just don't want to do it.
Yeah. Because they're trying to make as much money as they can. And I mean, you can go back to a lot of this is just like, I can't have my mansion if y'all gonna get, or excuse me, I can't have my third mansion if I have to pay you, you know, $15 an hour, even if inflation suggests that it should be higher anyway. I can't.
Yeah, and all these people making up things, like looking up words like capitalism. I mean,
even on a small,
eat the rich.
I don't want to say small business, because I'll say a moderate sized business. Damn, I can't do first class flights when I bring somebody in to take care of this stuff. I gotta have jump on coach
or private jets.
Yeah,
I can't.
First class. I mean, come on.
I can't do private or first class jets because
who does first class? I own 3 private jets.
I need to make sure that you all know that climate change is an individual issue. Meanwhile, I take my private jet for 18-minute trips 5 times a day.
Have you seen how cold it gets in Indiana? Climate change. The hoax.
And that's another thing about it that I didn't even put it in notes, but just like the endless growth that is required for capitalism is going to lead, it is already leading to destruction, because you always have to find new markets. You always got to tap into new shit, and you always got to figure out a way to flip it. I mean, just simple stuff, man.
I think we already discussed it, where capitalism requires some kind of free labor, whether it's slavery or you're getting a wage for it. At some point in that equation, it comes back to free labor.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's like, because again, even when Marx was describing this and this process in the colonial world, they're not even getting wages, right? so while Europeans are, this is why he was talking earlier about like the way that the English had a certain consciousness against the Irish, because even though they're not getting what they're worth, the materials that they use to do whatever their jobs are coming from the third world, the colonized world, and that's coming out of just complete, primitive accumulation. He talks about just complete conquest, or it's coming from slavery, where people aren't getting anything. And one of the reasons that slavery ended was because they started to calculate that it's actually cheaper to pay someone a wage than to pay for a slave. Like that was what industrial capital was basically saying. Like, I got to put up all this stuff for you. Like,
what they say? But y'all won't talk about that.
So it's like, and I don't have to upkeep you. Like, if you fuck up, I can just fire you. I don't have to like continue this. Right? Plus, it just as they would say, it hampered innovation. That's the capitalist term. So it's like, lastly, we'll speed through this. We gotta move on, but like
one last thing. For my religious folks out there, capitalism is the devil. If we're gonna relate it to something,
might as well.
Like we just went over why capitalism, how it works, and what it has to do to work.
There you go, Terrell. Dialectical thinking. That's what I'm talking about. My man.
God damn it, Ryan Pound.
Ryan needs a t-shirt that just says, "Let me show you how you've been dialectical thinking all day."
Dialectical thinking. Every time. But lastly, so Lenin talked about Marx's last contribution was actual politics or socialist politics. I'm going to, because class struggle, this is Engels at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. This is in one of the later editions. He writes, all history has been a history of class struggle, of struggles between exploited and exploiting, being dominated and dominating classes at various stages of social evolution. That is, a struggle, however, was not reached where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, can no longer emancipate itself from the class which exploits and oppresses it, the bourgeoisie, without at the same time forever freeing the whole society from exploitation, oppression, and class struggle. I don't know why I didn't put everything there. He said, and we owe all that thought to Karl Marx. Like that was the end of that sentence. So from there, there's the whole class struggle thing. Some societies hadn't gotten to develop to that point, but that's how he defined it. So Marx founds the Communist League. Marx and they were part of the founders of amongst other workers. First communist organization, the International Proletariat, created in June of 1847. So the Communist Manifesto was the principles of the Communist League. That's what that was written for. So it was written for an organization. It wasn't just a random thing somebody wrote. It was because they were trying to organize a worldwide revolution. Again, we're speeding through this part, but Marx gives us scientific socialism, which we just went through, where you can actually break down the thing, versus utopian socialism, which is the idealist conception of it, where we just know it's bad, which is what we often hear. Even when people talk about socialism, they're just like, capitalism sucks and it's exploitative. They can't really explain any of these things. That's more of a utopian concept of socialism, which is what Marx pushed back against at the time. So the socialism early period days criticized the existing capitalist modes of production and its consequences, but it could not explain them and therefore could not get the mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad. That was Marx. The more strongly this early socialism denounced the exploitation of the working class inevitable under capitalism, the less it was able to clearly show what this exploitation consisted of and how it arose. So if you have a criticism of capitalism today, which is not what it was when Marx was writing, I mean, even though a lot of the principles are the same, you have to actually study it. And that goes really for anything. You can't just simply say it sucks, because then you can get, that's how you get co-opted, because you don't know what you're talking about. So they'll give you something that's not even socialism. Like niggas think that just getting healthcare is socialism. That's not socialism. That's just social welfare or social democracy. But you think getting that, because you don't know what the shit is, so you have to actually study it. And then obviously communism, Marx, to each according to his needs, for each according to his ability. And communism has never fully been achieved on this planet. We've had socialism. Communism is a classless, stateless society where we've reached a point in society where we produce an abundance where everybody can share. And we don't need classes to govern these means of production and govern these resources. We can just share them with each other. That's a very simplistic explanation of it. And then just worldwide revolution. So these are the things that Lenin says he contributed. Now, there are some limitations. Marx and Engels, like I said earlier, apply much of their theory to Europe in which they lived, although they did not ignore the rest of the world. But if they are applying their methodology there, then some of the findings that they have are not going to be the same as in other countries because there's a different situation going on. So you have to take that methodology of historical materialism, dialectics, and you have to analyze class struggle and all those things and analyze your society and come to an understanding of what are the actual forces that are moving it, what are the forces that are working against you. You can't just take what he said about Europe and transfer it somewhere else. Some Marxists have done that, and I think that's led to some people to say it's Eurocentric, but that's just a flaw in the line of their thinking. Marx and Engels were never saying that everything that happened in Europe was universal. That's not what they were saying.
Yeah.
Colonial countries, like I said earlier, due to the underdevelopment produced by Europe, had not reached the stage of productive development that Europe was in, because as Europe is moving and building all these factories, and same thing in the Americas, these people are colonized and they're not able to continue the process of evolution that they were in prior to colonization. And also you've taken mass amounts of people, particularly in Africa, from their land and sent them elsewhere. So you depopulated the continent. All pre-capitalist societies in Africa were not organized around classes. So that's to say there were some maybe early communist classes or communalists, at least, like societies in Africa. Some were monarchies. Some were in bad Disney movies. But there were different societies, so you had to apply the method and understand your society. And we'll get to a few examples of that. So it's not the same thing. And as we talked about as well, communist revolution was very unsuccessful. So that's why Marx and Engels started saying, well, what's going on in the rest of the world? And Marx actually spent the last parts of his life studying Russia, because he was trying to understand how Russia could transition, if Russia could transition from a peasantry nation straight into socialism, and they didn't need to go through the phase of capitalism, because the argument is, even though capitalism sucks, capitalism does help build up the productive forces, the technology that we can use to then nationalize so we can all take care of ourselves. Capitalism does help expand those things. So there's an argument amongst Marxists about, do you need to go through a capitalist phase first? Like China is literally in the moment of trying to figure that out themselves, right? So between Marx's death and the Russian Revolution, from what I read, I don't really find. There was, between Marx's death and Russian Revolution, there was a few Marxists that were cool, but there was a lot of bullshit going on, to be honest. And I think, Rosa Luxemburg, who was assassinated, but and then the Russian Revolution, 1917, with Lenin, kind of helps propel things forward. That's how you get Marxist Leninism, because Lenin starts to theorize on Marx in different ways, because at this point now imperialism is really rose, monopoly capitalism. This is 1917. Marx dies, I think, in 1882, I believe. So this is a different time. Now we're in the midst of a First World War.
83.
83, okay, it was close. It was in the text that Lenin explored limitations of socialist movements in the West, where the labor aristocracy provided a barrier to socialist militancy and the potential for revolution in the East, where the weakest link in the imperialist chain might be found. So the labor aristocracy, I know we got a lot of terms today. Again, it's just they might be part of labor, but they're like the upper class of labor, and they often are the ones that will sell out the rank and file workers. That's the labor aristocracy. And they get bought off so well that they push down the militancy of anything else. Think of the black bourgeoisie as the labor aristocracy. So Lenin starts pushing about self-determination and the ability to determine the future of your country against this kind of what was called the national question, or the national bourgeoisie, because they would say we're all Americans and we need to unite under that. Even though the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are obviously in different classes, they would say we all need to say we're all Americans or we're all black or whatever, right? So Lenin was saying we need to actually work for the workers in these other countries. So they formed the Communist International, and this is where you start getting the question of the colonial. They formed the there's several Communist Internationals, but in this particular Communist International, the Second Congress of the Communist International, all communist parties, quote, should render direct aid to revolutionary movements among the dependent and underprivileged nations, for example, Ireland, American Negroes, and in the colonies. So they started unifying with the colonized world, and that's where you start seeing revolutions slowly pop up throughout the 20th century. They took on Marxist Leninism. Honestly, the colonized world didn't take on Marx directly as much as once the Russian Revolution happened. That's when you started seeing more revolutions. That's when you started seeing more African and colonized people engaging Marx, more so than when Marx was alive, because his work hadn't spread that far yet. But when they saw a revolution, and then Lenin and the Communist Party was more responsive to the actual question of colonized people, to the point where I think they even changed one of their slogans, workers of the world unite, or something of that nature, to workers and oppressed people of the world unite, because they understood that in the colonies, they weren't proletariats in the same way that we would think of them today. Many of them were peasants who just produced everything for the colony, so they could take those resources and then have the workers refine it, and then the capitalists could make money. So it's not the same relationship. So that's why you have to apply a different understanding. So there were different black Marxists, black communists that had certain theories on like how to understand black people in the United States, around the world, and those theories vary depending on the situation. Again, you have to understand the historical conditions. So Harry Haywood formed what was called the Black Belt Thesis, saying 86% of black people lived in the South. This is in 1928. So the South pretty much functioned as like black people in the South pretty much were like an internal nation within the South. Some folks would even go as far as say an internal colony. And that's where you kind of get the internal colony idea. So he says, in addition to ordinary forms of capitalist exploitation, American imperialism utilizes every form of slave exploitation, peonage, sharecropping, landlord supervision of crops for the purpose of extracting super profits on the basis that these slave tenants have grown up with superstructure of social and political inequality that expresses itself in lynching, segregation, and Jim Crowism. So like black folks weren't just exploited as laborers in the way that white people were exploited. Like there was a super exploitation because we're black, there's a way to lower our actual wages and pay us less and put us into a more of an indebted, almost feudal system when we're talking about sharecropping that, that white people were not in. So we needed to understand the condition of the black worker differently than we understand the white worker. And, these are things that other folks had to theorize about because Marx was not working with that diverse of a population, right? So also the stages of capitalism changed. So you had to have an analysis for that. So I ain't gonna go through everything, but just to name a list of people, and then we can close this up, who just picked up Marxism. None of these people are white. Just a random list of colonized people, black folks, and people of color. You had Ho Chi Minh, and the Communist Party of North Vietnam, who beat both the French and the U.S., kicked them out of the country. They were communists. You had Mao Zedong in the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And China now has a higher life expectancy than the United States. And they were a peasant nation in 1949. You have Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He used a Marxist analysis to understand how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You have Amilcar Cabral, who him and amongst comrades formed the PAIGC and used Marxist principles to organize against the Portuguese and eventually gain independence. Angola, formed the People's Republic of the Angola Marxist-Leninist Party, freed Angola, but U.S. and South Africa funded their opposition, which put them in a civil war from 1992 for 25 years later. But they actually raised literacy rates and everything and such. You have W. Du Bois, who really gets into Marxism when he writes Black Reconstruction. You have Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's still alive today. These are not all dead people. And she says abolition is small c communism. For all you abolitionists out there. You have Thomas Sankara, Marxist-Leninist that led revolution in Burkina Faso. You have the Black Panther Party, which we all know, but they utilize Marxist-Leninists and Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideas. The Black Panther Party, to raise money, used to sell the Red Book, which is a book of Maoist quotes. They used to sell just a little red book just to raise money for the party. The whole the survival programs really relate to the idea of self-determination that Lenin advocated for. You have Nina Simone, who said in a book, we never talked about men or clothes. It was always Marx, Lenin, and revolution. Real girls talk. And that was in conversation with Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote, what's the shit, Cam? I'm blacking out.
Watching God.
No, that's not.
No, that's wow. That's Zora.
You should know better.
That's how you know I'm tired.
Are you talking about To Be Young, Black, and Gifted?
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, she wrote
Raisin in
the Sun. Yeah. Angela Davis, obvious one, Communist Party. And another intellectual on prison abolition, wrote on prisons absolute. I'm just trying to push that even this abolition thing that people have tried to liberalize is very much rooted in Marxist theory as well. There's the All African People's Revolutionary Party, who Kwame Ture, who we watched the video earlier, was the leader of at the time. And they, obviously he lays out the socialist principles, and they say we want a Pan-African united, or we want a united Africa under scientific socialism. Some of these people were Marxists. Some of these people just engaged Marx, but we see literal revolutions and freedom were brought about by people who were engaged in these ideas. Now in part two, we're going to get more into, the specifics when we talk to Dr. CBS and Jody Dean. But this is just a long episode, but it's a layout of, why these ideas are relevant to us. And if you think it's still Eurocentric at the end of this, have fun. But that's that. So y'all can say y'all last piece on it.
Critique everything that people tell you. I think if there's anything to constantly take away, is to just constantly be questioning the information that you're being told. And when you hear something that feels off, also question where is this coming from? Why is it necessary that someone would want you to not know this? Who is actually leading the conversation? Is it actual people who are trusted scholars who have done the work? Is it people who know what their shit? Or is this a propaganda machine that is continuously aimed for you to not know the truth? Because if you don't know the truth, you can't actually win the fight.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you feel like Marx is, I understand to empathize with people. I understand why you don't want to hear from any more white people, because often white people have lied and stolen and I've done everything wrong. So I completely get why you're I just don't want to hear it. But again, we're not promoting Marx as an individual. We're promoting a set of ideas and a set of principles and a certain discipline and a methodology that many people have used, as we'll get more into detail in part two. But it doesn't, and I think even laying out his ideas, they seem to make fairly decent sense. So it's a question of what do you really want? Do you just not want to be bothered? Because other than that, like it's very idealistic and it's very bourgeois to just be like, well, it has to come to me in a silver platter, and otherwise I'm not gonna listen
a
to
brown
it.
platter at that.
Yeah, it's got to be a brown platter. And again, if you don't want to read Marx directly, fair enough. But we just gave you a list, and that's just a very small list of people who did read him and came up with their own shit. If you want to read black people, because black people as have contributed to the methodology, contributed to the ideology just as much. Like we've, as Fanon talked about, you have to stretch Marxism to understand things. We've added to it. We've improved it. Like we do anything you put us under, we improve these things and we make it better because our situation informs the way you understand it. So it's like,
and we're just great like that as black people.
Yeah. So if you don't want to appreciate that, whatever, but to be like, well, it's Eurocentric, well then tell all them niggas that got free with it. That is, you know what I mean? Like,
Amen.
go tell.
The mic drop.
Whenever, I think a rule of thumb for anybody that listens, like if the state discourages certain ideals, run to it.
Yeah.
Don't tiptoe, run to it.
I think also looking at like who, even if you don't necessarily trust it or you don't know where to look, like who are your trusted scholars? Who are the people that their work, their fight, their leadership speaks to you, and who are they studying? Because if you go directly to who they're studying, it's going to lead you on the right path. And probably 7 out of 10 times you're going to find Marxism in there.
Yeah. But as much as we covered, like there's so much we didn't cover. We didn't talk about the propaganda that has to go into selling capitalism back to people and how you have to constantly, push bullshit, and how the idealism and the bourgeois mentality, all of that gets put into the education and put into the media. Like that's the superstructure that we were talking about. Like all those things are constantly like permeating throughout the society to reproduce a certain line of thought that legitimizes this bullshit, right? Like that's a constant thing in nature, and that I think is understudied. We can study like surplus value, but like the level of propaganda that capitalism has evolved towards, that wasn't nearly as bad during Marx's time, because again they were just more like, you're talking about this shit, you can't publish it. Now they're like, you can publish it, but we're gonna give you so much indoctrination that by the time you publish it, it's gonna be bullshit anyway. So it's like you can say whatever you want, but
capitalism or with communism and socialism in general, like we learned in school, like it's bad.
Yeah.
Reasons why? I couldn't tell you why.
Because I remember they told us that somebody's gonna get like, it's funny how they sell it. Like you're not gonna get the value of what your work, because you're gonna have to share it with somebody else. So even if you worked harder than somebody, you got to give it to them. Like that's literally what they told me. It's like, it's not, so everybody being equal is not fair. What if you worked harder? What if you have more skills? What if you went to school? Blah blah blah. It's like that was the logic. You got to share with everybody, even though
even in that logic, they never explain. Like I never heard this in school. I had to watch movies and stuff to find this out or do my own research. Even in like slavery, they measured how much output a slave was doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some of the best understandings of the actual workplace came from slavery, like as far as perfecting it, because
they were still a slave at the end of the day, right?
And they didn't quit. Right. Like they couldn't leave, so you could study them for years. So it's like,
right.
So
my social standing is still a slave.
Yeah, like so you could just be like, all right, this is how you motivate somebody to do this. Like we kind of talked about that in our algorithms episode, but it's like one of the first some of the first salaried employees were overseers. So it's just like the whole economy built.
So now it's funny. I went from being a slave to an overseer, where now I'm salaried, but my salary is nothing, because
it's still not what I'm doing.
They'll find a reason to not pay me as much, even as an overseer. They'll be like, oh well, you got to oversee these niggas, but we still got to deduct your food, your housing, your this, your that. So you'll have pocket change.
It's funny, on the whole subject of Marxism being Eurocentric, I remember so vividly in high school, in Miss Blythe's public speaking class, there's a white dude who was talking about the benefits of communism. Even then, in that class, I was like, ugh. Even if I didn't understand, I was like, I don't know about that. And years later, here I am.
Yeah, because I mean,
they've that's good advertisement because they've made communism and socialism seem as if it's just the worst thing on earth.
Of course. Yeah. For years, the
without you even
literally made folks feel like if you were a communist, you were like a demon. This evil lurking communist was your neighbor. Like the Red Scare was happening.
Yeah.
And his white dude in high school was right the whole time.
The best example I can give is like when a child like granted broccoli is great. I love broccoli. But when a child doesn't like broccoli and they don't like a certain food, and they're like, "Oh, it's terrible. I'm not gonna eat it. I'm not. No." And then they try it, and it's the shit. Like I hate it.
But at least the kid.
I tried it and it was good.
But the kid doesn't. The kid is actually looking at broccoli and it just looks gross to them. Really independent of anything else, they just don't. But
like I said, that's the best example.
But it's like communism is like if you told the kid that the broccoli is gonna kill them. If you told the kid that if they do the broccoli, they're going to prison. If you told the kid that by eating the broccoli, they're a traitor. You know, if you did off, because, you know, they say communists are traitors to America and all that. If you tell the kid that by doing that, it's going to turn you into a cracker. You know, all these things are in this broccoli. So you're like, I'm never going towards anywhere near this broccoli because it's got to be awful. And then the moment that communism doesn't go perfectly, then, you know, it's like, well,
I have all kinds of criticisms of it. Like, as soon as you, we got to shout them out. The episodes you sent us, the podcast you sent us to watch.
Rev Lev.
Yeah, shout out to them.
We got to shout them out because he made a great example of it. He said, even a person, like, you can have this half-brain idea or explanation of communism, and you can just sell it as it being so terrible and this, that, and the other, compared to the system that you were born in and grew up in.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's and it's like even things that aren't even communist, even just a little bit of relief is labeled communist. Like you see, the Republicans will literally be like, you know, the radical socialist Democrats. I'm like, where? And please give me those people if they existed, but they're not. But if a Democrat is I don't like any of these niggas, but if a Democrat is just like, I don't know, let's tax people or something, you know, it's a radical leftist socialist agenda. You know, if they're like, let's have radical left, like anything that even remotely speaks to redistribution.
They labeled Obama a socialist, and I'm like, bro, he didn't.
Bro, I remember in college there was
I ain't the smartest man alive. He wasn't touching the tip.
Nah.
By far.
Not by far. Man, I remember.
But yeah, thanks for listening, y'all. I hope that people who had no clue about this shit learned something, and even if you know it well, hopefully we did it justice. The next episode, we're gonna spend more time on just really talking about the activity that Black folks did, particularly Black women. Again, organized fight. So we'll be dealing with that. We did this episode primarily to set it up where you could hear that episode and not have to be confused about what Marxism was, and we don't have to ask them to explain all this shit. Like, you can just listen to this. We did the John the Baptist thing for them, right? So, like, you can just break this down, and then, you know, and we'll leave all the sources, as always, in the link. If anybody actually wants to read Capital, you know, hit me up. You can't have my physical copy, but I can. There's plenty of. It's very easily to get. You can get that book off of simple Google. You don't even need me for that. But like,
you can't have it because I'm gonna steal it when I go to this house.
Okay, if you're gonna steal, I will let you steal if you'll read it. But but like,
hey, he know I'm not gonna read that.
Yeah.
I'm just bullshitting for the sake of it.
But yeah, I mean, I think again, this isn't the only thing we say people should study, but just study in general. But we felt like this was an important thing to cover, just to understand the ins and outs and why so many people have been interested in it. I mean, this dude's been dead since the 1800s, and niggas are still talking about him. Like, something about that has to be, either this dude's a terrible person and what he wrote was terrible, or there's got to be there's really not even a lot of in between if people are that interested. Even the people that hate on him spend a lot of time hating on this dude, and he's been dead for a long time. So I just got to understand, like, man, what is it about this tradition that has been put in motion, that, like, what is it? So yeah, we'll wrap it up, but yeah, thank you for listening. Peace out.
Peace.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the stay.